Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'm going to be giving an update on my Superdwarf reticulated python, Thomas Aristotle. Now, to clarify, he's a 50% Superdwarf, and his mother was 50% kayuadi, was 50% kayuadi, and his sire was 50% kalatoa, making him 25% kayuadi and 25% kalatoa. Both of which are superdwarf or islands from which the populations are small enough. They're called superdwarves. But he is from actually a fairly large bloodline, because of course not everything where you cross a mainland and a superdwarf comes out to be the same size. There seems, from what I've heard, Garrett Hartle talks about this, some dependency on the size. There's more dependency on the size of the mother than the size of the father. So if you breed a male superdwarf to a female mainland, and then if you keep doing that sort of thing, you tend to get a bigger bloodline than if you breed in the opposite direction. And so there are various things that go into it. I don't want to get into because I'm not a breeder, and I don't want to get into the details of how you breed retics, but there seems to be an epigenetic component to it. Epigenetic meaning around the genetics, because it's not just a question of what genes you have, but how the cells decide to actually express the genetics that results in the phenotype or what the animal's actually like. So he comes from a larger superdwarf cross bloodline, because I had actually been looking for a dwarf. I wanted an animal that was in the 8 to 9 foot range as an adult. And so when I talked to Garrett, I described this, and then I was looking for a dwarf, and he said some of his dwarf breedings, dwarf cross breedings, would probably be in the right direction. I wanted a male that was this, and so that's where I was looking. But he happened to have he's a het for albino. And so he's in a pairing of an albino with a het for albino. I think his father was a het albino motley tiger, and his mother was a pure albino, lavender albino, I believe. So he was one of the few normals that was produced from this clutch, and it was a larger bloodline. So he's probably going to get into the size that I'm looking for. That is to say, to be an 8 to 9 foot as an adult. So he's not entirely representative of what a 50% superdwarf cross would normally be. At least, there are many breeders that work on small bloodlines, and they're 50% superdwarf crosses, and they tend to produce smaller animals than he is. But he was, as I said, since he's from a bigger bloodline than is typical for the crosses, at least that Garrett does, he was actually in the range of what I was looking for. And so I decided to go for him. I really liked his personality. I like his pattern. And so he's just a little over a year old. He was born in mid-February. So he's a year and a month old. He's I last measured him a few months ago, and he was an inch under 5 feet. He's not growing quite as rapidly as it had been for a while there. And so he's probably a few inches over 5 feet at this point. And he was 1.5 pounds, I think, last time I weighed him, which again was a few months ago. So he's getting there, as a year old. He's bigger than the rest of his clutch mates, interestingly. I'm not feeding him super heavily or anything. But he does seem to be growing, because I have met at least one other, and Garrett knows some of the people who have his clutch mates, and he seems to be among them around the biggest. He's looking at something. It's been a really interesting experience having a retic, and superdwarf cross retic. It's not just that they're shorter too. They tend to have more slender bodies than mainlands do, because mainlands get to be not only long but relatively big. They're not anacondas. And they tend to be even a little more slender than a Burmese python. But mainland retics are still a big animal. An 18-foot retic might be that thick around. Whereas a 10-foot Superdwarf is more like that thick around. And actually, I did a video where I interviewed Garrett, and we were holding his snakes that were both in the like 8 to 9 foot range, and they're only like that thick around. So it's not just that they are shorter, but they're also more slender bodied and lighter too, which also makes them easier to hold and so on. So it's been really interesting. There are a bunch of things that I've learned, and a few things about retics. And the one thing I learned that was definitely interesting was that, one very practical thing that I've learned, and I've learned come on the other side of too, is there are a few weeks. There's a week where I didn't feed him back when he was eating. These days he's eating about every 10 days. Because he's starting to get old enough where you want to pull back on the food because you don't want to make a fat snake. They're not normally like super successful hunters. They're not pure ambush predators, retics, but like they're not constantly eating in the wild, and constantly eating is bad for them. It makes them unhealthy. They have a lot of fat stores and poor muscle tone, and they get lethargic, and they get all sorts of organ trouble if you really, really overfeed them. And so you want to feed them well to keep them healthy, so they'll put on lots of muscle and so on, but not so much that they start going past that into getting fat. But at one point he had got an injury in his mouth, and his mouth had actually swelled up a bit on I think it was on his left side, and so it swelled up a bit, but then it went back down again, real fast. Like I noticed it, and about 8 hours later, the swelling had gone away. So I kept an eye on it, but he seemed to be fine. But because he probably had like some sort of cut that had swelled in his mouth that did not get infected, thank God, I just kept an eye on him. And then to give him some time to heal, I didn't feed him the next week because he's a snake. He can go months without food and be perfectly healthy. As long as he gets some food again. Like, they are amazing at being able to do without food. And in point of fact, obviously, like, when they intentionally go without food, they tend to be a little, like, put on a little extra first, but, like, it's not that uncommon for breeding activity to make them just stop being interested in food, and they just spend their time trying to, like in the case of a male, find a female, look around and find a female. In the case of females, they wrap around their eggs and then don't eat for the entire time their eggs are incubating. Sometimes they go off food even while the eggs are developing in their body before they lay their eggs, possibly so they don't disturb their eggs too much. So, like, they can go many months. They're designed to go many months without food, and even to survive times without food. Like, to go many months without food some of the time of the year as a normal thing. And, like, if they simply can't find food, to go really long periods without it. So skipping one meal is nothing to them. Not really any more significant than skipping one meal for a human being. Like, if you just don't eat lunch or don't eat dinner or something, it's not a big deal. But, especially I think because he's a growing retic, I then fed him very lightly. Like, his next meal, at a time when he was normally getting small rats, I gave him a mouse, an adult mouse, and then the next meal after that was a weaned rat. And so, having gone a bunch of weeks with very low food, he was getting kind of hungry, and his behavior changed. It shifted. It was very interesting to watch. He was very much more on alert. Like, when I would these days, when I open the cage door, he's kind of interested a little bit. Like, pick up his head, he'll look over, he'll sniff at me a little bit. A lot of the time, if he's sitting on his perch looking at his food door, he often won't even react to me opening the door. Maybe he'll kind of turn his head over at me, give a quick tongue flick or two. But for the most part, he's not that interested. During this time, when he was, it was a while since he had a normal-sized meal, like a few weeks since he had a normal-sized meal, he was going on high alert. He would come out of his enclosure pretty quickly, and like look around and be real interested, and just sort of much faster than normal, much more active than normal. Like, his normal is like this. Like, you can see he's interested in what's around him, but he's just kind of slowly moving around. This was much more of like a darty sort of, quick darty behavior where he'd like go 6 inches and then stare at something and then go a few more inches and look for it in a real fast sort of, fast pause sort of motion. And around that time, he actually, he bit my son once, and it was, as far as I can tell, it was actually, my son hadn't washed his hands, but normally that didn't matter. But this time he was just so eager for food. This is again, this is like 6 months when he was a lot smaller than this. And, we had been taking him for granted a little bit because he was so good. He was just perfect before this. But that time he was just really kind of food eager. Don't fall off. Really kind of food eager. And this like extreme food eagerness was related to him, having gone without, very much in the way of meals. And what I found is that there was one other time where I had to like skip a meal essentially, and he started getting a bit food eager like that again. But when I feed him regularly, and as I said, I feed him a fair amount. I'm trying. He's got a good thickness. He's got lots of muscle. He's got a small amount of fat on him, but not too much. And so like you can't see you can see a few muscle striations, but not all of his muscle striations, which seem to be like pretty good. Like as I said, he's got a good amount of muscle. Like when he's tensing his muscles, which he's doing on my side, not yours, you can kind of see some of the muscle striations, but not real clearly. You can't see any of his ribs under pretty much any conditions. But you can, feel he's like, got a good solid amount of muscle on him, and you don't really feel it like being squishy or anything. So I'm not underfeeding him by any means. And I'm not trying to like restrict his food to keep him small. I'm trying to give him as much food as he will turn into bone and muscle and so on without making him fat. And when he is being fed regularly on that schedule, it seems to generally keep him quite healthy. He's really not. He's always calm like this. He's always, he's interested in the world. He's not the most active snake in his enclosure. He sometimes moves around a little bit, but he's often very content to just sort of rest. But if I take him out, he then gets real interested and real active. And I do take him out usually at least once or twice a day, sometimes a bit more. So he gets a lot of exercise. And so that's one thing I learned, that like you do want to make sure, at least what I found with him, is I want to make sure that, and I think this is partially a function of growing, that he gets a regular enough supply of food that he never gets food eager, because then mistakes are a lot more possible when he's, like, speaking colloquially, feeling hungry. So that's the one thing I learned to watch out for, that I had, as I said, and it was much better that he be, a little underfed for a few weeks while he was healing than to give him a normal sized food item and stretch out a cut that hadn't healed fully and then possibly make a worse tear or something like that, and then, risk infection, and infection can be really bad in snakes as in humans. And so he's much better off this way. It worked out, much better. It's just something to be aware of, is that sort of food eagerness that comes with being fed a little bit lighter for a time period. And so that's sort of one thing. Another interesting thing that I've learned about him is his coloration is fascinating. So one thing about retics, which I may have mentioned, I've mentioned in previous videos, and you may or may not know, is the degree to which they are able to change how dark they are. So they're able to go from a pretty dark state phase, like they're able to be fairly dark, and they're able to go fairly light. His sides right now are kind of medium-ish. The gray parts, you can see, are kind of medium-ish. They can go from like a sort of a very, very light gray that in the right sort of lighting, if you're not paying attention, looks almost like off-white, to a fairly, like a very dark sort of gray. Like he doesn't go close to black in the gray sections, but he can go to a very dark gray. And the yellows that are in this section kind of follow along, as well as what's inside of his saddles, can follow along with that. where they get fairly dark to fairly light. The yellows get a lot brighter when he's, it was called fired up, or when he's reduced his dark, like reduced the darkness as much as he can. It's often called being fired up because the colors become more vibrant and more vivid and brighter. And so there's that change that he can do. And this can go, he can go fairly light to fairly dark in like a few minutes. He usually doesn't. It usually tends to be more of gradations. When he's warm and in bright lights tends to be when he fires up the most. When he's colder or in the dark, he tends towards darker colors. When he goes into shed, he tends to much darker colors. So there are various correlations there. Retics, of course, are iridescent. I'm assuming you'll see at some point, because depending on the exact angle of the light and hue, they can get rainbow sheens on them. And quite a lot of it. I mean, to the point where, especially when they're a little bit darker, because of course the darker a snake is, the more you can see the iridescence on them, because there isn't some other color that's kind of blocking it off. They're also a lot more iridescent in direct sunlight too. Sunlight is very strong, and the iridescence you get in sunlight is really quite something. So there's that aspect to his color. His color also is just different from his head to his body. So over on by his neck, it's much more of ordinarily like it's a yellow. When he's really fired up, it's a yellow. When he's kind of in a mid-range tone, it's kind of like a mustard yellow. Whereas near his tail, like over here, is much more of always just sort of a goldish yellow. And my understanding is, so he's brightened up, like his colors, his yellows especially, have become a lot more yellow as he aged. He was not nearly this yellow when he was first hatched. My understanding is that they keep on brightening until they're like 3 or 4 years old. And so around like 3 or 4 is probably when they're at their sort of maximum of yellow. And so it'll definitely be interesting to see that. But he's also a lot more yellow towards his tail than towards his front, and it's something of a continuous gradation. Although even on his sides, I don't know if you can see it from there, he's more yellow towards the bottom than he is towards the top of his saddle. So there's that. Also kind of interesting, I don't know if you can see, but on the bottom of what technically is his belly, but what looks like his neck, because if you look at a snake skeleton, there are ribs all throughout here. You don't have ribs in your neck. Your neck has no ribs on it. An actual snake's neck is very, very short, and their body starts, and it's just very, very long. But anyway, on what colloquially we'll call his neck, has turned actually quite yellow. That it didn't used to have the yellow sort of running down the sides. And also kind of interesting is every one of his belly scales has a tinge of gray towards the bottom of the scale, which gives him this sort of striped look at the bottom, which is also very interesting and a color change. But another thing that I've noticed in terms of color, which the colors of retics are just really interesting, very much, there's so much more to their color than there is to, say, like a ball python. You know, ball pythons, they change with age, obviously, but to some degree, you know, ball python's color, like lighting affects what all colors look like. Because, you know, if you shine a red light on something that's yellow, it doesn't look yellow because there isn't yellow in the red light. So, like, at a trivial thing, if you shine a green light or a blue light, you know, rather than full spectrum light, you don't get, you don't get colors other than red, green, and blue. So, like, that's a really obvious thing. If you have bluish light, things look different than if you have yellowish light, and so on. So, those two are some obvious differences in lighting. But for him, angularity is surprisingly important. Like, one thing that I've noticed recently is the colors on his neck, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this from there, but when you're looking at him from his head towards his tail versus the other way around, the same part of him will look more yellow when you're looking essentially from behind. If you know, looking tail to head along his body. Now, he can be like this, he can be facing 2 directions at the same time, so describing head to tail, but if you're looking from behind his head at his neck, he looks a lot more yellow than if you're looking from in front of his head at his neck. And so that is weird. I actually first noticed this only like a few weeks ago. I was outside in the sunlight, and he happened to be like interested in the ground and was sticking his head down. And I looked, and his neck looked so much more yellow than I was used to it looking. Used to it being more of kind of like a mustard yellow, a yellowish brown sort of color. And then I looked, and then I took a look. Huh, that's kind of dark. Wow, that is a lot more yellow. Huh, that's kind of dark. That is a lot more yellow. And that's when I realized, and actually I looked at it in pictures too, because I got like this really interesting picture where there's a little bend in his neck, and you can just see the color, the difference in color that actually looks pretty much the same over like this portion of him, but he was bent in the middle about here. And yeah, it was just such a different color. So in wild type retics, you get some very bright and vivid colors, but only if you're looking... Well, no, I mean, I'm up to a year old. From what I understand, the colors get a lot more vivid as they get older. And then as they continue to get older, it can be a lot more dependent on being fired up and fired down. They can also get darker as they continue to get older, as you're getting to like a 10-year-old snake. From what I gather, this is something I need to do more research into and can't say for sure. But there's also there's dependence on a lot of stuff. But having said that, so he's going to continue to get more yellow and so on. But one of the things I've really noticed is how brighter his colors depends a lot on the lighting, depends a lot on his mood, and it depends a lot on where you are relative to him when you're looking at him. Because he can have some very, very bright yellows if you're in the right lighting, at the right angle to him. And if you're in the wrong lighting with the wrong angle and he's fired down, he can look very dullish. And so, to some degree, I'm coming to the conclusion that what a lot of the morphs and retics do is not to change their color nearly so much as to remove the variability in their color. So for some of them, to some degree, like when they're amelanistic, of course, then the colors are brighter because they just don't have they don't have any darkness whatsoever underneath them. And even when he's extremely fired up, he doesn't turn pure white underneath his colors. So the albino is going to be brighter than the wild type is going to be. But I don't think it's that much brighter if you're under all of the ideal conditions for looking at the wild type. I think it's just that with the albino, you don't have the other conditions. Now, having said all that, by the way, yellow is not the only pretty color in the world. And I've got to say, as much as I'm a fan of bright yellows, the steel grays that you get on his sides, like when he's middle, neither fired up nor like all the way on the other extension, but when he's right in the middle, the grays that you get on his side spears, the gray side spears, you have to look closer at them. The yellow is much more obvious from a distance. But the grays that you get are really fascinating colors. They're really, really very pleasant. And then even more when you get the iridescent sheen on top of them. It is really, really pretty to look at his grays. And in fact, when he's closer, what I find, the thing that I normally look at is actually his grays, because they're kind of a purplish bluish, especially if there's any iridescence, because the iridescence tends to green blues, or the iridescent colors you tend to see the most of. And so that really gives like a bluish gray to almost purplish gray coloration when the iridescence is on top of the grays especially, and it's just a fascinating sheen of colors. And so, which is something you give up, like albino retics, from what I gather, you don't see the iridescence as much simply because the reflectance of the whites and the really bright yellows overpowers the more subtle iridescence, and so it's much harder to see iridescence on an albino retic. So one of the trade-offs that you get in going for not the wild type, but something like an albino, is that you don't get to appreciate the iridescence nearly as much. You don't get these really kind of interesting bluish grays and kind of fascinating colors like that. And obviously now, albino, you give up the contrast too. You don't have the black versus the yellow right next to each other. that you do with wild type. But then there are the other wild types, like tigers, for example, which aren't that different. They elongate the pattern and do some curious stuff to it. But, so then you get to things like Sunfire and Platinum and Lemon Glow, which tend to move the pattern around and make for a lot more yellow and just fewer of the pigments in the yellow. So I've never seen those up close and in person to really be certain of what's going on with something like Sunfire or Platinum. But they're interesting and they're pretty snakes, to be sure. And interestingly, like regular retics, they take a while to color up. So like if you look at a baby Platinum or a baby Sunfire, you can tell because the pattern is a bit different. The yellows are more over. You tend to see a lot less of the black speckling because their patterns are rarely perfectly clean, and there'll be like a few black bits of the occasional black scale in between and so on, and that tends to go away a lot with like Platinums and Sunfires, from what I gather, and those aren't quite the same gene. So I'm not trying to denigrate morphs, to be clear. Wild type I do find fascinating. I love the complexity of wild type. I'm not against morphs in general. Like my ball python is a morph ball python. But retics, there's something about their wild type I just find so fascinating. And it's really interesting how colorful their wild type can be. And that. So just a few other things before I close the video out. Something I found interesting, there's Garrett Hartle interviewed Blake Stewart. And a joke that Blake Stewart was potty training his retics, or not so much potty training, but something to that effect, that he, because he would take them outside and they would defecate there. And something I find fascinating is and he mentioned it wasn't so much that he was training them, it's just they don't tend to go that often, and if you take them outside, they do seem to, the slithering around in the grass seems to stimulate them to relieve themselves. And so, it turns out to be true. He does often, if I take him out to slither in the grass, he does often go and poop if he's, got it in his body to let out. So, kind of an interesting thing that like you can actually, to some degree, you can cut down on the amount of time you spend cleaning just by taking your retic for slithers out in the grass, where they will then, kind of like with a dog, they'll just go out there where it's easier to clean, and you're sure as heck you're going to just spot clean your lawn. Kind of a fascinating thing that turns out to also work. Does seem to work for retics generally. Let me see anything else that I found in my 1 year of keeping retic. As I mentioned, as I've talked about in previous videos, food door works really, really well. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. He's just interested. Like, he's got the nice long tongue flicks and stuff. I wasn't paying enough attention. It's the one thing about holding him like this. I really should be paying full attention to him. And he just happened to turn his head into my hand in a way that startled me. So he wasn't doing anything even slightly aggressive, and I shouldn't have been startled. But because he happened to move, and I happened to be moving towards him, he bumped into me in a way I didn't expect. Anyway, I love the long tongue flicks. He only does it sometimes, because it's the long tongue flicks are only for when something's really far away. Yep. I also love how long they can go, suspending themselves up. But yeah, like the long tongue flicks are only for when something's really far away, and when things are closer, he tends to do much shorter tongue flicks. Like if he's just tongue flicking to something right next to him. The other thing is, if he actually hits it with his tongue, I've noticed he then pulls his tongue right back in to like scent what his tongue touched. So like to actually do that thing where they stick it out and then just wave it around a whole bunch has got to be when they want something real far away that they don't touch or anything. But I do love those long, slow tongue flicks. They're just really cool. Anyway, terms of other things, anything else interesting in my 1 year of retic keeping? Yeah, I think that's pretty good. This video is far longer than it should be anyway. Hopefully seeing him slither around is interesting. It's been cool. I've really enjoyed him. He's a lot of fun. He's a ton of fun to hold. He's really good. You can see, like in my video about the food door, that like it works really well. Like I can sometimes, because I like to alternate birds and rats. So I've got both chicks and quails that I will give to him, as well as rats that I give to him, because I like, variety, and variety is generally good. And so and he certainly likes it. He eats everything like that very readily. And so I will give him chicks, I will give him quails, I'll give him rats. So I tend to alternate either chicks than rats, then quails than rats. And because he grew a little faster than I was expecting, I still have some chicks and some quails around that are a little bit on the small side for him. So I will tend to these days what I do is I simulate him having gone into a nest, and I'll like feed him 3, and I was able to open the door and pet him in between quail number 2 and quail number 3, and he was not food aggressive in the slightest. But then the moment I opened the food door and put the 3rd quail in, he nabbed that thing. So yeah, food doors, they work great. Got a video about that. So until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.